The massive locomotive sat abandoned on a forgotten stretch of railway track, its once proud exterior now covered in rust and grime, a relic from an era when steam and diesel ruled the transportation industry. The machine stood 40 feet tall and stretched nearly 70 feet in length, weighing approximately 200 tons of solid metal, rubber, and glass. Its presence dominated the overgrown railway yard where it had been left to decay for nearly 15 years, a monument to industrial obsolescence in a world that had moved on to faster, more efficient means of moving freight across the continent. Two brothers from the neighboring industrial town had heard rumors about the abandoned locomotive for months before they finally decided to investigate the opportunity. The older brother, a man in his late 30s with calloused hands and a keen eye for salvageable materials, had spent 2 decades working in various scrapyards and metal recycling facilities throughout the region. His younger sibling, barely 30 years old, possessed an engineering background that proved invaluable when assessing the potential value of complex machinery and industrial equipment. Together, they had built a modest but profitable business buying, dismantling, and reselling scrap metal and salvaged components from decommissioned factories, closed manufacturing plants, and abandoned industrial sites. The brothers had developed a reputation throughout their community for taking calculated risks on unusual purchases that other scrappers avoided. Where others saw worthless junk and prohibitively expensive demolition projects, they identified hidden value and profitable opportunities. Their success stemmed from a combination of mechanical knowledge, physical determination, and an almost intuitive understanding of which abandoned equipment contained valuable materials worth the investment of time and money required to extract them. The locomotive represented their most ambitious undertaking yet, a purchase that would require every dollar of their combined savings and every ounce of their collective expertise. Before you continue discovering how this incredible story unfolds, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another amazing story like this one. And if you're really enjoying the content, consider becoming a member with a super thanks. It helps us bring you more incredible tales of unexpected discoveries and hidden fortunes. Also, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers from around the world. The auction for the locomotive took place on a cold morning in late autumn, with gray clouds hanging low over the railway yard and a bitter wind cutting through the assembled crowd of potential buyers. The brothers arrived early, having conducted extensive research on the machine during the preceding weeks. They had studied technical manuals, consulted with former railway employees, and calculated detailed estimates of the locomotive's weight and material composition. Their research indicated that the machine contained approximately 15 tons of steel, 2 tons of cast iron, substantial quantities of aluminum, and an estimated amount of copper wiring that they hoped would make the entire venture profitable. The bidding started conservatively, with several established scrap dealers offering cautious amounts that reflected the significant costs associated with moving and dismantling such a massive piece of equipment. The locomotive would need to be cut apart on site, as transporting it intact was financially and logistically impossible. Heavy cutting equipment would be required, along with cranes, trucks, and a crew of workers willing to undertake the dangerous and physically demanding work of reducing the massive machine to manageable pieces that could be sold to metal recycling facilities. As the price climbed higher, competing bidders dropped out one by one, recognizing that the profit margins were becoming dangerously thin. The brothers continued bidding, pushing beyond the amounts they had initially planned to spend, driven by a conviction that the locomotive contained more valuable materials than their competitors realized. When the final bid was accepted, they had committed virtually every dollar they possessed to purchasing the rusted behemoth, a decision that would either prove brilliantly calculated or financially ruinous. The immediate aftermath of the purchase brought a mixture of excitement and anxiety. They owned a 200-ton locomotive sitting on abandoned railway track, miles from their workshop and storage facility. Before any dismantling could begin, they needed to secure proper permits from local authorities, arrange for heavy equipment rental, and assemble a crew capable of safely cutting apart the massive machine. The younger brother spent days navigating bureaucratic requirements, filing applications, and negotiating with equipment rental companies, while his older sibling began the physical work of assessing exactly what they had purchased. The locomotive had been manufactured in the mid-20th century, during an era when railway companies commissioned machines built to last for decades of continuous operation. The engineering was robust and overbuilt by modern standards, with components designed for strength and durability rather than cost efficiency. The engine compartment alone contained thousands of individual parts, from massive pistons and crankshafts to intricate electrical systems and cooling mechanisms. Every surface was coated in decades of accumulated grease, oil, and industrial grime, making initial assessment difficult and unpleasant. Working alone during those first days, the older brother began documenting everything he could access without heavy cutting equipment. He photographed serial numbers, measured dimensions, and created detailed inventories of visible components. The work was slow and methodical, requiring him to crawl through cramped spaces, balance on precarious surfaces, and expose himself to sharp edges and toxic residues. The locomotive had been left unsealed when abandoned, allowing weather and wildlife to penetrate its interior spaces, creating hazardous conditions filled with rusted metal, rotting insulation, and accumulated debris. As he worked his way deeper into the locomotive systems, the older brother began to notice something unexpected. The electrical wiring throughout the machine was far more extensive than their preliminary research had suggested. Modern locomotives used aluminum wiring to save weight and cost, but this older model had been manufactured during an era when copper was the standard conductor for all electrical applications. Every circuit, every connection, every motor and generator in the massive machine utilized pure copper wiring, and there appeared to be far more of it than he had anticipated. The discovery prompted immediate recalculation of their investment. Copper prices had risen substantially during the months since they had begun researching the locomotive purchase. What they had originally estimated as perhaps 1,000 pounds of salvageable copper wire now appeared likely to be several times that amount. The electrical systems alone contained dozens of heavy-gauge copper cables, each one potentially worth hundreds of dollars. The more he explored, the more copper he found, hidden in unexpected locations throughout the locomotive's complex internal structure. When the younger brother arrived with the first load of cutting equipment and supplies, his siblings shared the exciting news about the copper discoveries. Together they began developing a more systematic approach to dismantling the locomotive, prioritizing access to areas likely to contain the most valuable materials. They would need to work carefully and methodically, as hasty cutting could destroy the copper wiring and reduce its salvage value. Copper wire cut into short pieces sold for significantly less than intact lengths that could be stripped and sold as bare bright copper, the highest grade recognized by recycling facilities. The brothers established a work site around the locomotive, setting up a generator for power tools, a small shelter for brakes and equipment storage, and safety barriers to prevent unauthorized access. They invested in heavy-duty reciprocating saws, plasma cutters, and specialized demolition tools capable of cutting through the locomotive's thick steel panels and structural members. The work would be dangerous, requiring constant attention to safety protocols and careful coordination to avoid injuries from falling debris, sharp edges, and the inherent hazards of cutting apart a massive machine filled with unknown materials and chemicals. The first major cut into the locomotive's exterior revealed the scale of the task before them. The steel panels were 3/4 of an inch thick in some locations, requiring multiple cutting blades and frequent stops to allow overheated tools to cool. Behind the exterior panels lay complex layers of insulation, structural supports, and mechanical systems, all of which needed to be carefully dismantled and sorted. The brothers quickly established a routine, with one brother operating the cutting equipment while the other managed the separation and sorting of materials into designated piles for different metal types. Days turned into weeks as they worked steadily through the locomotive's structure. The engine compartment proved particularly challenging, with massive mechanical components that resisted their cutting tools and required creative problem-solving to remove. They discovered that many of the locomotive's major components were held together with enormous bolts that had seized solid after decades of weathering. Traditional wrenches and impact drivers proved useless, forcing them to cut through the bolts themselves, a time-consuming process that generated showers of sparks and consumed cutting discs at an alarming rate. Despite the challenges, each day brought new discoveries that validated their investment. The cooling systems contained substantial quantities of copper tubing and brass fittings. The braking systems incorporated bronze components that commanded premium prices from specialized recyclers. The electrical generators housed heavy copper windings that alone weighed several hundred pounds. Every compartment they opened revealed additional materials of value, reinforcing their growing belief that the locomotive contained a genuine fortune in salvageable metals. The brothers developed an efficient system for managing the enormous quantities of material they were generating. Each type of metal was sorted into separate containers or piles, with copper receiving special attention. They carefully stripped insulation from copper wiring, using specialized tools to avoid damaging the metal underneath. The bare copper wire was weighed and secured in locked containers, as its high value made it an attractive target for thieves. Even the lower-grade materials like steel and cast iron were meticulously sorted by composition and cleanliness, as proper sorting significantly increased their value when sold to recycling facilities. The breakthrough discovery occurred during the third week of dismantling work, when they finally gained access to the locomotive's main electrical cabinet, a sealed compartment located deep within the engine section. The cabinet had resisted their initial attempts to open it, protected by corrosion and layers of industrial paint that had essentially welded the access panel shut. When they finally cut through the panel and pulled it away, they were greeted by an astonishing sight that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. The electrical cabinet contained the locomotive's primary wiring distribution system, and it was essentially a solid mass of heavy-gauge copper cable. Dozens of individual wires, each as thick as a human thumb, ran in organized bundles throughout the compartment. The installation appeared almost artistic in its complexity, with every connection carefully routed and secured according to engineering principles that prioritized reliability and safety over material economy. The copper cables alone in this single compartment weighed more than they had estimated for the entire locomotive's electrical system. The younger brother immediately recognized that they had uncovered something exceptional. The sheer quantity of copper in this compartment suggested that other sealed areas throughout the locomotive might contain similar treasures. They had been working from the outside inward, dismantling the more accessible exterior components first, but this discovery prompted a strategic shift. They needed to locate and access every sealed electrical compartment before continuing with the general dismantling work. Using the locomotive's original technical documentation, which they had obtained from a railway historical society, they identified 7 major electrical cabinets and junction boxes distributed throughout the machine. Each one would need to be carefully accessed without damaging the valuable copper wiring inside. The work required patience and precision, as hastily cutting into these compartments could sever the copper cables and reduce their value significantly. Over the following days, they systematically opened each sealed compartment, documenting and photographing what they found. Every single electrical cabinet contained far more copper than their original estimates had suggested. The locomotive had been engineered with extensive redundancy in its electrical systems, featuring backup circuits and duplicate connections that ensured continued operation even if primary systems failed. This conservative design philosophy, combined with the era's preference for copper conductors, had resulted in a machine that contained copper wiring totaling several tons rather than the mere 1,000 pounds they had initially anticipated. As they extracted and weighed the copper components, the true value of their purchase became clear. The locomotive contained approximately 8,000 pounds of pure copper in various forms, from thick power cables to fine wiring, from bus bars to motor windings. At current market prices, the copper alone was worth more than twice what they had paid for the entire locomotive. The other valuable materials, including aluminum, brass, bronze, and high-grade steel, represented additional profit that would make this project their most successful venture by a substantial margin. The realization brought both elation and a new set of challenges. They were now sitting on a fortune in copper and other metals, stored in a remote railway yard with minimal security. The brothers invested in additional security measures, including motion-activated lighting, surveillance cameras, and a reinforced fence around their worksite. They also accelerated their work schedule, pushing to extract and transport the most valuable materials to secure storage at their main facility as quickly as possible. The physical demands of the work intensified as they focused on removing the copper components. Many of the heavy cable bundles weighed hundreds of pounds and were wedged into tight spaces that made extraction difficult. They employed winches, come-alongs, and manual labor to pull the cables free from their decades-old installations. The older brother suffered several minor injuries during this phase, including cuts from sharp metal edges and burns from hot cutting tools, but the potential financial reward drove them to continue despite the hardships. Word of their discovery inevitably spread through the small industrial community. Other scrappers and metal dealers, initially skeptical of the brothers' large investment in the locomotive, now viewed the project with envious recognition of its profitability. Some offered to purchase the remaining materials at premium prices, hoping to participate in the windfall, but the brothers politely declined all offers. They had taken the risk, done the research, and performed the hard labor required to uncover the locomotive's hidden value, and they were determined to see the project through to completion on their own terms. The work continued through changing weather conditions, from the cool autumn days when they had begun to the first snowfalls of early winter. They erected temporary shelters to protect their work area and invested in propane heaters to prevent their cutting tools from becoming too cold to operate effectively. The physical discomfort of working in freezing temperatures added another layer of challenge to an already demanding project, but they maintained their focus on the goal of completely dismantling the locomotive and extracting every ounce of valuable material it contained. Not every component proved as valuable as the copper discoveries. Significant portions of the locomotive consisted of low-grade steel and iron that barely covered the costs of cutting and transporting it to recycling facilities. The brothers learned to quickly assess which components were worth the effort of removal and which should be left for final cleanup. Time became a precious commodity as they raced to complete the project before winter weather made the work impossible. They hired additional help for the heaviest lifting, bringing in experienced workers from other demolition projects they had undertaken. The hired crew proved invaluable for removing the locomotive's massive engine block, a single component that weighed several tons and required careful coordination with a crane operator to lift and load onto a flatbed truck. The younger brother supervised these operations while his older sibling continued the meticulous work of extracting copper wiring from increasingly difficult-to-access locations. 6 weeks after beginning the dismantling work, the locomotive that had once dominated the railway yard was reduced to a skeletal frame sitting on its original wheel assemblies. Everything of value had been removed, sorted, and transported to various facilities for processing and resale. The site was cleaned of debris and hazardous materials, leaving only the basic frame and wheels, which they would remove during a final cleanup operation. The transformation was complete, and what remained barely resembled the massive machine they had purchased at auction. The brothers began the process of selling their salvaged materials, starting with the copper that represented the majority of their profit. They had carefully maintained the copper in the highest grade categories, stripping all insulation and removing any attachments that could reduce its classification. The bare, bright copper commanded the highest prices from recycling facilities, and they had accumulated enough volume to negotiate favorable rates from multiple competing buyers. The younger brother handled the business aspects of selling the materials, obtaining quotes from different recyclers and timing the sales to take advantage of favorable market conditions. Copper prices fluctuated daily based on global supply and demand, and he monitored the markets carefully to ensure they sold at optimal times. The strategy paid off, as they managed to sell the majority of their copper during a temporary price spike that added thousands of dollars to their ultimate profit. The other materials followed a similar pattern, with each metal type sold to specialized recyclers who offered the best prices for particular materials. The aluminum went to an aerospace recycler who valued its high purity. The brass and bronze components found buyers in the plumbing and marine industries. Even the low-grade steel and iron, which had seemed barely worth the effort of removal, generated modest but meaningful revenue when sold in bulk to a large-scale metal processor. As the final checks cleared their bank account, the brothers calculated their total return on the locomotive investment. The copper alone had generated profits exceeding $200,000. The other materials added another $75,000 to their earnings. After deducting all expenses, including the purchase price, equipment rental, hired labor, transportation, and various fees, they had netted approximately $220,000 from the project. The return represented more than 5 times their initial investment and exceeded the combined profits from their previous 3 years of scrap metal operations. The success of the Locomotive project transformed the brothers' business in fundamental ways. The substantial profit provided capital for expansion, allowing them to purchase better equipment, hire permanent employees, and pursue larger opportunities they had previously considered beyond their reach. They invested in a proper facility with climate-controlled storage, heavy-duty processing equipment, and security systems appropriate for handling high-value materials. More importantly, the experience taught them valuable lessons about research, risk assessment, and the importance of thorough investigation before committing to major purchases. They had succeeded not through luck alone, but through careful study of the locomotive specifications, thoughtful analysis of material values, and willingness to undertake work that others viewed as too difficult or risky. These lessons informed their approach to future projects, encouraging them to look beyond obvious opportunities to find value that others overlooked. The brothers became sought-after consultants in their regional scrap metal community, with other dealers requesting their assessment of potentially valuable demolition and salvage projects. They shared their knowledge generously, understanding that the industry benefited when experienced operators helped newcomers avoid costly mistakes and dangerous practices. Their reputation grew not just as successful scrappers, but as knowledgeable professionals who approached their work with intelligence and integrity. The Locomotive project also strengthened their partnership, demonstrating how their complementary skills created advantages that neither brother possessed individually. The older brother's hands-on expertise and physical capability combined with the younger's business acumen and technical knowledge to create a formidable team capable of tackling complex projects that required both mental and physical capabilities. They formalized their business partnership, establishing clear roles and responsibilities that played to each brother's strengths. News of the brothers' success inspired others in their community to look at abandoned industrial equipment with fresh perspective. Several copycat projects emerged as other scrappers attempted to replicate their success with different machinery, though few achieved similar results. The brothers noted that many of these imitators failed to conduct adequate research before purchasing, resulting in projects that proved unprofitable or had to be abandoned partially completed. The Locomotive project became a case study in their local business community, referenced by entrepreneurs and business students as an example of how thorough research and calculated risk-taking could generate exceptional returns. The younger brother was invited to speak at a regional business conference, where he presented a detailed analysis of their decision-making process, the challenges they faced, and the factors that contributed to the project's success. Their success also brought unexpected attention from environmental organizations who recognized the brothers' work as an important contribution to material recycling and resource conservation. By dismantling the locomotive and returning its materials to productive use, they had prevented tons of valuable metals from continuing to sit unused in an abandoned railway yard. The organizations highlighted their work as an example of how proper recycling practices could recover valuable resources while cleaning up industrial waste sites. Local media covered the story, featuring articles and television segments about the brothers who had turned a rusty locomotive into a fortune through hard work and clever analysis. The coverage brought them additional business opportunities, with property owners and industrial facilities contacting them about other equipment that needed removal and recycling. The Locomotive project had established their reputation beyond their immediate region, opening doors to larger opportunities and more profitable contracts. With substantial capital available and enhanced reputation, the brothers began evaluating their next major project. They considered several options, including a closed manufacturing plant with extensive machinery, an abandoned power generation facility, and a decommissioned ship that offered similar opportunities to the locomotive but on an even larger scale. Each opportunity presented unique challenges and potential rewards that required careful evaluation. They approached these new opportunities with the same methodical research that had served them well with the locomotive. The younger brother spent weeks investigating each potential project, consulting experts, studying technical documentation, and calculating detailed cost and profit projections. The older brother visited each site personally, assessing the physical challenges and practical aspects of dismantling work that couldn't be understood from documents alone. The business had evolved beyond simple scrap dealing to become a specialized industrial dismantling service. They were no longer just buying and cutting up old metal. They were solving complex problems for industrial property owners who needed large equipment removed efficiently and completely. This transition to a service-based business model offered more consistent income than the feast or famine cycle of equipment speculation, though they remained open to extraordinary opportunities like the locomotive when they appeared. They hired their first permanent employees, experienced workers who had impressed them during the locomotive project. Building a reliable team meant they could take on multiple projects simultaneously rather than limiting themselves to one major undertaking at a time. The brothers focused on training their employees in proper safety practices and efficient dismantling techniques, understanding that their reputation depended on maintaining high standards in every aspect of their work. As they reflected on the locomotive project months after its completion, both brothers recognized it as a turning point in their lives and careers. The financial success had certainly been important, providing security and opportunity they hadn't possessed before, but equally valuable were the lessons learned and confidence gained from successfully completing such an ambitious undertaking. They had proven to themselves and others that careful analysis, hard work, and calculated risk-taking could generate extraordinary results. The older brother found particular satisfaction in the physical accomplishment of dismantling the massive machine. He had spent countless hours in cramped, uncomfortable spaces, working with dangerous tools and heavy materials, but the challenge had been invigorating rather than discouraging. The work had demanded everything he could offer in terms of skill, strength, and determination, and he had proven equal to the task. That sense of accomplishment remained with him long after the last check had been deposited. The younger brother valued the project's intellectual aspects most highly. The research, planning, and strategic decision-making had fascinated him throughout the process. He particularly enjoyed the detective work of discovering exactly what the locomotive contained and calculating its value. The business negotiations and material sales had exercised skills he hadn't fully utilized in their previous smaller-scale operations. The project had demonstrated that his business education and analytical abilities could be applied profitably in an industry often dominated by physical labor over intellectual effort. Together, they had created something larger than either could have achieved individually. The locomotive project represented perfect synergy between complementary skills, with each brother contributing essential capabilities that made success possible. This understanding shaped their vision for the future business, emphasizing team building and skill development to create an organization capable of tackling increasingly complex and profitable projects. The abandoned locomotive that sat rusting in an overgrown railway yard had contained a fortune in copper and other valuable materials, but it had taken the brothers' unique combination of knowledge, determination, and courage to reveal that hidden wealth. Where others saw only an impossible challenge and prohibitive costs, they identified opportunity and calculated that the potential rewards justified the substantial risks. Their success validated the approach they had developed through years of smaller projects, demonstrating that careful research and thorough analysis could uncover value that remained invisible to less dedicated competitors. The 8,000 pounds of copper they extracted from the locomotive represented just the most valuable component of a much larger story about transformation and possibility. The massive machine had been transformed from an abandoned relic into $220,000 in profit, but more importantly, two brothers had transformed their modest scrap business into a thriving enterprise with a regional reputation and bright future. The capital, confidence, and recognition they gained from the locomotive project positioned them to pursue opportunities that would have been impossible just months earlier. The railway yard where the locomotive had sat for 15 years was now empty, with only oil stains on the ground and compressed vegetation marking where the 200-ton machine had rested. The brothers had completed their final cleanup, removing even the wheel assemblies and the rail sections they had purchased as part of the lot. The site had been returned to a clean condition, ready for whatever future use the property owner might plan. Nothing remained of the locomotive except photographs, memories, and the substantial bank balance that documented its hidden value. Before we end this incredible story, we want to remind you one more time. If you enjoyed discovering how these brothers turned an abandoned locomotive into a fortune, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have notifications turned on for more amazing content. Consider supporting us with a super thanks if you really loved this story. It means the world to us and helps us continue bringing you these fascinating tales. And don't forget to comment below telling us where you're watching from and what you thought about this incredible discovery. Did you suspect the locomotive contained that much copper? What would you do if you found a similar opportunity? We love reading your thoughts and connecting with viewers from around the world. The story of the brothers and their locomotive spread through industry circles and beyond, becoming a modern legend about hidden value and the rewards of hard work. Other scrappers studied their approach, trying to replicate their methods and find their own locomotives filled with copper fortunes. Industrial equipment auctions saw increased activity as dealers searched for similar opportunities, though few would ever find anything quite as spectacular as the copper-filled locomotive that had launched two brothers from modest success to genuine prosperity. The combination of factors that made the locomotive project so profitable, from its outdated but copper-intensive electrical systems to the rising metal prices to the brothers' perfect blend of skills, created a once-in-a-career opportunity that they had been prepared to recognize and brave enough to pursue. Their story continues to inspire entrepreneurs and workers in the salvage industry and beyond, demonstrating that extraordinary opportunities sometimes hide in plain sight, waiting for someone with the knowledge, courage, and determination to reveal their true value. The locomotive had always contained its fortune in copper, but it took the brothers' vision and effort to transform that potential into reality.